Hello and welcome back. We are now on to our main topic today, which is looking at other role-playing games and comparing them to D&D. And we are very fortunate to be joined by Mike Olson, who will talk to us about Fate, which is what we started on last week, but want to continue the discussion with today. So first of all, Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So last week we talked about the basics of Fate, but before we get into a little deeper dive, we want to know more about you. What's your role in Fate and what's your role in the role-playing game industry?
Well, I discovered Fate in 2006 with Spirit of the Century, when there wasn't like Fate so much as a separate thing. It was just Spirit of the Century, and you hacked the Spirit of the Century to do things. But and I'd been I still am a diehard like Champions hero guy before that. And because it was very satisfying working with the numbers and getting things just right, like little tweaks here and there and tinkers. And then I found Fate, and it was like you could do that with words instead of numbers in Fate. And it like blew my mind. And I was just immediately got super into it. After the first time I played it, I was like, that was great. You know what else this would work well for is this other genre. And then I just started hacking it for other genres and bringing it to conventions in LA to Strategicon. And there I found the late great Morgan Ellis, who was doing the same thing at the same time, also discovered it and also was hacking it for between like planetary romance and 17th century swashbuckling and just like, post-apoc stuff and just everything. We're just both of us hacking for everything. So that's how we met. We, played in each other's games and stuff. And then I started a blog called Spirit of the Blank, because back then everything was Spirit of the something.
Yeah.
Because that's how you hacked it, because there was no Fate as a separate thing. So there's Spirit of the 17th century. I did a Futurama game that was Spirit of the 31st century, and like on and on like that. So Spirit of the Blank was my blog to like just do every thought I had down there. And I had that blog for maybe a year. And then I got contacted by Chris Birch and Sarah Newton at Cubicle 7. They had made Starblazer, which was the first Fate game after Spirit of the Century. Again, before Fate was a separate product. Like it didn't even exist as its own thing. But they made the first other game off of that. That was a sci-fi game. And then they wanted to make the fantasy version of that, because Starblazer was a comic book series. And some of those comics were fantasy oriented. So that they were making Legends of Anglaire, which was the fantasy treatment of Starblazer. And they found my blog and they asked if I wanted to be part of it. And I said, yes, of course. And then when I saw in their document, they already had some posts from my blog in there. So it's a good thing I said yes, because they were committed.
Wow, that's hilarious.
So that was a very interesting first freelancer experience, because I did all the things wrong that you should do. Like I didn't know what I was getting paid. I didn't know my per word rate until after I was holding the book in my hands. But it was a great experience still just to get to work on, something. And then I kept hacking Fate, and then I hacked it. I really want to do superheroes. That was like my holy grail of Fate. So I did a hack for that, and I was running that at conventions. And then I got contacted by Arc Dream. They wanted to do a Fate edition of the Kerberos Club, which is a really, really cool setting by Benjamin Baugh, which like you absolutely must see. It's like super powered weirdos in Victorian England. It's the best way I can put it. It's not a superhero game, but it's like people with powers, and they're weird. And so I made a whole new version of Fate for that we called Strange Fate. And was very, very customizable, even more so than usual Fate. But because I'm still a hero guy, it was like more numerically customizable, right? And then so that was cool. That was a lot of fun to do that. And then Brian Clevenger, who writes Atomic Robo, he contacted me because he saw Strange Fate, and he said I was able to make Atomic Robo in a game for the first time, and it felt right, like it was actually the real character. Do you want to do a role-playing game of Atomic Robo? And I was like, sure. I don't know what Atomic Robo is, but yeah, you bet. And he sent me some issues in PDF, and I saw like a page and a half. And he had pitched it as Ghostbusters plus Raiders of the Lost Ark plus Buckaroo Banzai, which like, you got me a Buckaroo Banzai for sure. Sure. And I was like, yes, please, let's do this. I'll do it for a penny award, pay me on the back end. I don't care. Just like, let me do this thing.
So I
then
see you learned all the freelancer.
Oh yeah. Well, it was so good.
How to do it by then.
Yeah, I know. No, I hadn't. I only recently have, really. But while we were talking about that, Brian started talking to Fred Hicks on Twitter about Atomic Robo, and Fred Hicks from Evil Hat was like, "We're big fans of Atomic Robo." I was like, "Oh no, I'm going to lose this thing to Evil Hat. They're going to do it instead." And that's not true, because Fred Hicks is such a good guy. He was like, "Yeah, let's have Mike do it for Evil Hat." So that's how I started working for Evil Hat. Wow. And then almost simultaneous with the development, simultaneous with the development of Atomic Robo, they started working on Fate Core, like a new actual separate edition of Fate, not Spirit of the Century or not Dresden Files, or, And they asked me if I wanted to work on that. I was like, yeah, of course. That's like, just being a fan of D&D, and then them saying, "You want to work on the new edition of D&D?" Like, yeah.
Amazing.
So that's how I got hooked up with Evil Hat. And then I did a bunch of stuff for them. And ended up being like a rules guru guy for them. And I mentored some people through their first books on Fate. And so then now their focus is shifted to Forge in the Dark now. Mm-hmm. But while Fate was going strong, I was very busy with them. Nice. So that's how I get to Fate.
That's fantastic. Okay. And of course you've done some D&D stuff, and you worked on Skull Kickers, is that right?
Yeah, I was the lead writer for Skull Kickers with Jim Zub. He wanted to do to celebrate the 10th anniversary of his creator-owned comic, Skull Kickers. He wanted to do a big, sprawling D&D adventure. So he wrote a comic, like a new one-shot of Skull Kickers, and then we did a big adventure that tied into that comic that was all in one volume called Skull Kickers, Caster Bastards, and the Great Grotesque. And that was really a lot of fun to work on. That was very cool.
That's awesome. That's great. Yeah. Well, so anyone listening now knows exactly why we brought you on our second Fate show, because you're here to mock how we explain Fate.
I have notes.
Good. We'll look forward to the corrections part of the show.
No. I don't want to do that.
So backing up a bit, what is it that called you to Fate? Why do you love it so much of a system? What's sort of the short elevator pitch you'd give to folks as to why you think it's amazing?
Well, it's right there in Fate Core in the beginning of the book. It's about competent, proactive heroes leading dramatic lives, right? It can do any sort of game that involves that. If your game does not have those three things, then Fate is not a good fit. But most games are that, so it's probably a good fit. But I'm seriously, it was the thing with like words instead of numbers that really got to me. Like in Hero, I would take a paragraph to explain, like, okay, this is how this power works. I can steal someone else's power and I can use it again, but only like this and with these advantages and these limitations. And in Fate, I could write an aspect that was like, describing my power, and I knew what I meant, and the GM knew what I meant, so that was good enough. That was it. In Hero, because it gave me the tools to really, really drill down and narrow down the thing, I wanted to do that. But in Fate, it didn't call for that, and I didn't need to do that. And us knowing the shared knowledge of what that thing meant between the player and GM was like enough. And that was very attractive to me. I liked it a lot. Just being able to, I don't know. I have a degree in creative writing, so being able to use words instead of numbers is up my alley, let's say.
Yeah. And it's funny because in D&D you get that anyway, right? Even though everything's written out in very complex rules, you still a lot of times have to come to an agreement with the game master or between players about what things are. So that part of Fate, even when I started playing it, didn't bother me all that much because we were doing that in our D&D games anyway.
Right.
And this just sort of cuts down on that need to parse, the math or parse these very complex statements and just say, this is who I am, so this is what I can do. Yeah.
Well, on a related note, I played in a Technocracy mage game a long time ago, and I made a very specific character. I didn't know anything about the setting. I made a very specific character. He could do like these things, and that's it. But to be able to do those things, I had to get certain dots and skills to, because that's what let you do it. But if you got that many dots, you could also do these other things. And during the game, the GM was like, well, you could do this too with that. I'm like, no, I can't do that. I can only do these things. I was like limiting myself for no reason. It was so frustrating for them. But that's the kind of thing, like with an aspect, would very easily like elide all that other stuff. And we'd know what I meant,
So do you look at lots of other role playing
ahead.
games and say, oh, that came from Fate? Oh, that, like, do you see that all the time?
I mean, no, but a little. I mean, some games explicitly say, like, this is a combination of Fate and Cortex Plus or something like that. But certainly the inspiration mechanic in 5e, when I saw it, I was like, all right, welcome to the 21st century. Pretty cool. So yeah, so a little bit, but I don't know if I think there was a lot of what's that word when people come up with the same thing at the same time independently?
Convergent evolution or something.
Sure, that. I think there was a lot of that going on because the like indie games in the early 2000s were like kind of pushing in different directions, and I feel like just a lot of people were influenced by the same things, and so they ended up making some things that worked a little the same. Like you mentioned, new Cypher System and Fate Accelerated, the way that stunts are made in Fate Accelerated, and the I can do this because of that thing in Cypher System. Those games came out in the same year, so neither was influenced by another, but like we were thinking along the same lines.
Right. Yeah. So last week we talked about the basics of Fate. Without nitpicking too much, is there anything that we said that was not absolutely true,
or that you would want to put a spin on, or
yeah. Well, I guess I did write some things down. I'm not kidding. I did do a little research.
If you're a creative writer and a game designer, I hope you wrote things down.
Yeah,
that's how I listen to podcasts too.
I'd say one thing about approaches in Fate Accelerated, which I love. One thing I guess one overarching thing is that in Fate assumes that everyone is coming to the table, like, this sounds bad, but in good faith. Like, it's not designed to prevent people from power gaming or to balance things like that. Like, again, I love D&D, but we know the rules are written the way they are so that people can't just like get away with murder, literally or figuratively, when they shouldn't. So things like, I feel Fate really sings when everyone shows up to the table, like knowing that we're all here to tell a story and we're going to cooperate with the system because it's going to let us do that in a good way, right? You couldn't do like a layer assault in Fate, like fourth edition layer assault. I loved, but like that's not the sort of thing that happens in Fate. Or even like, to me, even like a book of stat blocks of monsters in Fate is like, but what if that isn't right for me in my game? So I think that's one big thing. And one place where that comes through is in approaches in Fate Accelerated, because we're talking before, about like, if you have a +3 in forceful, if you're good with forceful, you want to do things forcefully all the time. Like that's not a problem. As long as you understand that your narrative always has to have you being forceful. And also if you're being forceful, you're not being anything else. You're not being subtle. You're not being, you're not being smart about it or whatever. Like it's important for the GM to know, like, well, if you're doing it this way, you're not doing it that way. And then when things go wrong, the way you weren't doing it is why. Like you can lean on that. And I think that makes a big difference when, or even because I've played in games where I'm like, I have a +4 in flashy. Okay, I'm going to be flashy all the time. And it's a challenge. Like, how are you going to do everything in a attention-grabbing, flashy way, unnecessarily complicated? Like, how are you going to do this every time? And it was fun. It wasn't an issue. It was just fun to do. So it does require a certain understanding of like what it is we're doing. I don't think that's necessarily explicated in Fate Accelerated, but in all the philosophizing that happens around Fate, because there's like a lot. It feels like a philosophy sometimes. That's something that's come up. Like, if you're doing it this way, you're not doing it that way. So I think that's, I don't know, something I wanted to mention. That's maybe not the most important thing, but I think it's important for Fate Accelerated because that makes the game like better if you're playing with that in mind.
Great point.
What else was I gonna? Another thing, not something you talked about, but something I think is worth noting is the roll of dice in Fate. If we're going to compare it to D&D, like you roll your die, or a lot of games. So you roll your die, you add your number. Did you do the thing? No, you didn't. Okay, done. But in Fate, the dice rolling, like your skill rating or your approach rating is like how effective you are with that thing. and then your difficulty number is like how hard it's going to be. And the dice are kind of like almost like a formality, like, let's see what random nonsense gets in the way. That's the dice. And the fate points are you exerting narrative control to contradict that reality, right? To contradict the randomness thing. Like, that can't be the case. I'm the third best swordsman on the continent. Like, so no, let's re-roll that. Like, I could not have done that for it. Things must go better for me than that. And I think that's an important note, because the game often comes down to, like, how committed are you to succeeding at this now? How many fate points do you want to spend, or how many resources do you want to use up, on the table? How important is it to you? Because it might not be that important for you to succeed. Now, you don't have to spend fate points every time to try to do it, but if you really, really want to nail it, or is it just enough to succeed a little because you're trying to create an advantage? You want to get that aspect in there for someone else to use or whatever. So I think that is a notable difference, I think, between Fate and a lot of other games.
Yeah, and I think it's a concept that's hard to grasp when you first encounter it as a D&D player, if you're a primary D&D player. Like when I played Gumshoe the first time, which has a similar concept, you roll a single D6 to see how you do, and the target number is not too hard, but then you can spend points to just add to that. And so you can guarantee that your roll will be a success. And that concept, when someone explained to me, I'm just like, well, this is bad design, And then I'm playing and I'm going, actually, this is great design, because it really lets me choose when I say no. I'm in this kind of Mission Impossible type situation, and I will shoot the vampire and I will succeed because I'm that good. But I can't do that always. But I can do it when I really need to, because it's what I feel the story should be around who my character is. And that it's a thing to get used to, but it's a really powerful concept. And probably the best example I'd give in a D&D format is when you're like, the great diplomat, and then you roll a 1, right? But you gave a great in-character speech, and sometimes there are those times when you just feel like this should succeed, and everybody at the table feels that way. But there's no mechanic in D&D usually to just fix that. But games like Fate have that ability to fix that situation, right?
Yeah. And even the that could probably be an overcome action, by the way. Maybe if you're trying to talk someone into something, right? And another big thing in Fate that has migrated a little bit to D&D is the concept of succeeding at a cost. It didn't originate with Fate, but it's a thing that I definitely have seen in D&D in one paragraph in the PHP. But when you do take the overcome action in Fate, which is like I'm trying to jump over a chasm or something, or convince a guard or whatever. If you fail, you can just choose to succeed at a cost. Like, something bad happens, if you at a minor cost or a major cost, but like, it recognizes that, like, well, this would suck if you just couldn't open the door. Like, you couldn't pick the lock, and now that's the rest of the game is on the other side of that door. So just you succeed at a cost. You succeed, but as you open the door, there's guards behind it, or whatever it is, or your lockpick breaks, or all the many, many things that we have done. We have kludged together in D&D when it didn't ask us to do it. But yeah, that's and the jumping the chasm was the thing that sparked that, because, like, well, what happens if you fail? Do you just fall to your death? Like, is that just one roll and you're dead? Like, there's got to be something else. You succeed, but you sprain your ankle on the other side, whatever it is. But everything in Fate is really built around that idea of, like, let's, like, keep that story going and feed stuff in the story. Even in a fight, being taken out in a fight, in a physical fight, even doesn't mean you're dead. It just means you're out of the conflict. Whoever took you out gets to decide what happened to you. So there's no worrying about, like, dual damage or, did I say I was going to knock him out or whatever? If you're the one who does it. And by the similar token, conceding, when you decide, like, I don't want to do this anymore, I have no chance of succeeding on this. Or even if you're just being strategic about it, you can say, I concede, here's how I get taken out. You get taken out, but you get to decide how it happens. And then you get paid fate points for it too. So you do get something out of it.
That brings us right into one of our comments from Michael Phillips via Mastodon, who says, last week you missed one of my favorite pieces of technology from Fate, which is the conceding mechanic. It's part of why fights don't just have to be the last stress box or hit point. It's a rich source of fate points if the fight has gone badly for you. So it's just one more way of controlling the story and getting a mechanical benefit as well by making the story more interesting.
Yeah, and you talked about being paid fate points. You get a fate point for every consequence you've accrued in the fight. So really, it incentivizes you to get really beat up and then give up. I mean, you could give up early on if you wanted to, but that's, but yeah, it really wants you to like give everything you had. You get beaten up and you're like, fine, I concede. And the GM says, okay, here's a fate point for conceding and 3 more for all your consequences, and then that's a fortune, 4 fate points at once. That's wild. And it gives you the ammo you need to be awesome later in the game, which is like what that whole dynamic is about.
For sure. Well, we didn't talk last week about campaign and character creation, which is another big difference between most D&D campaigns and most fate-based campaigns. So could you tell us a little bit about what that campaign and character creation process is like in fate-based games as opposed to what you normally see in a D&D campaign?
Sure. I should preface this by saying that fate is extremely malleable, as you guys know. So there's no generalization I can make about fate games across the board, because even like fate games published by Evil Hat don't all work the same way. Like Shadow of the Century doesn't work like Atomic Robo, doesn't work like Spirit of the Century, But generally speaking, when you make characters, you come up with your high concept aspect, which you talked about last time, about like what's my log line for this character? What's what's my thing, like a scoundrel with a heart of gold, Han Solo or something like that, right? And then used to be in Spirit of the Century, you would everyone have a book that they start in, and then someone else would have a guest role in your book, but that's how you get aspects. You'd say like, I give myself this aspect for this book, and this other person was in my book, and they're going to give me this aspect for that. So you might have like other players giving you aspects for your character to cement the connections between you.
And by book you sort of mean like there was a thing in my backstory, right? There was a
but it's talking about because it's a game about like 20s pulp adventure. Like everyone has their 100-page pulp adventure book series that they're in, every character in the game. So you talk about your these previous things that you shared. So yeah, typically there is a process by you go around the table and you talk about like, I have this aspect, and then someone else might say, you know what, that's cool, I think I was there for that, and I'm going to say I have this aspect too. Or someone might throw in like, well, what was that person's name? Like, what was that villain's name? I'm going to be involved with that villain. I'm going to be their son or whatever. They like things just pop up like that. And the GM just sits there and goes like, okay, right. We keep track of all of this. So that's often the case. And then, I mean, I guess I've jumped right to character creation, but we skipped past the like campaign creation part where you sit down and say like, what kind of game do we want to play at all? And then like, who are the antagonists in this game? What's the struggle about, and what's the central conflict, and what are the issues? What are the impending issues and the long-term issues? Like what's going to be a problem later on, and what's a problem right now? And Fate Core talks about how you can use those two kinds of issues to focus the game on either like, if all the issues are impending, then it's about like, let's go change the world right now and like deal with problems on a daily basis and, like just keep busy kind of. It's like episodic sort of. But if you have impending issues, then it's more of a long-term problem you're talking about, like Mr. Big is off there somewhere in the shadows that you have to deal with. I feel like this is being very vague, but honestly, there's so much, it's so versatile that it's hard to pin it down.
Yeah, well, and I love it because it what I think of it as contrasting it with D&D, right? Where in D&D, the DM goes back into their cave and comes up with a concept and a story and a setting. And they may talk to their players as a session zero, like, hey, do you guys want to deal with, pirates, or do you like jungles or whatever? And you come up with some concepts. But you kind of show up and then you say, well, we might have session zero to talk through some things, but we're going to go into an intro, and you guys, the setting will slowly reveal itself to you. Unless I give you a setting document, it's going to play out and you'll learn things as you go. But Fate is, let's build it together. And sitting around the table, folks might say, wow, I'm really loving this Andor TV show. I kind of want something like that. And someone goes, yeah, I'd love something like that, but also with this kind of element to it. And then what ends up happening as a result is that everybody is ready for the game before the game begins, and aligned towards what the game is going to be, in a way that in D&D, you could have run many sessions and you might have a couple of players who are still not quite getting into it because they don't know how to make their character fit. But in Fate, you've collaborated on the campaign creation and then created the characters after that. So it all lines up, right? Which is really powerful.
Yeah, everyone gets hooked into everything. And it's certainly everyone at least has the opportunity to get hooked in the very beginning, right?
Mm-hmm.
It might not be everyone's cup of tea to determine setting elements, but like everyone has that opportunity to do it.
Yeah, when I worked with Encoded Designs on a game called Part-Time Gods of Fate,
yes,
we have you build your neighborhood, and since you are a part-time god, you have to have places of power in your neighborhood that you are drawn to. And it was just taking what's right there in Fate core and the rules, right? Create the thing, create the aspects, create your connections to it, create an NPC that will be part of that. Give that NPC an aspect. What are your connections to these people, and what are your connections to each other as your pantheon, right? Your god of pepperoni and your goddess of sewer rats come together to form this pantheon.
I mean, that's a natural pairing. Sewer rats and pepperoni.
Exactly.
One of the things that I find, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but when I think of D&D campaigns, or actually it works in either way. You can think about a D&D campaign and say, what would the movie be like? And the answer is you have to change it. Or you think about a movie and you say, how would you make that into a D&D campaign? And you kind of go, well, I'd have to tweak it. It can't quite work this way. But when I see sort of the way Fate works, it's like things can work that way much more easily. Like it'll, because of the way the players are working towards it and adapting to it and building off of it, you really can actually see that. And so it's like, I find it much easier to say, here's how Andor, the TV show, would become a Fate campaign than I do it would become a D&D campaign.
Oh, absolutely. This happened to me with Hero too. Every time I see a character on TV or a movie, I go like, well, how would I build that character? But certainly in Fate, once you start thinking in those terms, you see like aspects in everything, and they're like, oh, I see what he did there. Like the whole conversation with Han Solo and Greedo. This is one of Morgan Ellis's favorite examples of this. That whole conversation is Han setting up, creating advantages, right? He surreptitiously unsnaps his holster, like that's an aspect, like, blaster ready to go. That's an aspect you put on the scene. Or, he's like, I don't have it with me. And he's looking over this, like Greedo's distracted. Like he's just making aspects as he goes. And then he invokes them all for free at the end and blasts Greedo out of the movie. So yeah, definitely. But that's what Fate is meant to emulate, sort of cinematic stuff like that. But it's also versatile enough that, you can cram just about anything into it. Like like I said, as long as it's competent, dramatic protagonists leading, or a competent, proactive, leading dramatic lives, like that's every movie for the most part. So yeah, it's definitely very cinematic.
When you sit down to create a D&D campaign, often you are just stealing things from the Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or whatever your favorite thing is, and you're using those sort of standard issues, standard tropes of what the trouble is. With Fate, you can do so differently. You can do so both with player interaction, but it sort of gives you a framework for setting up that trouble in the background and connecting it to real elements of the game that the characters will interact with immediately or can interact with more emphatically than this sort of high trouble in the background. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how it helps with storytelling?
Yeah, sure. I'm running a Greyhawk game right now in 5th edition, and you mentioning that made me think that, like, if it were a Fate game, we would have campaign aspects everywhere. Campaign aspects of, like, I use his back, and that's because that's an aspect that we can interact with mechanically. Like, I can compel that aspect, give the players fate points, say, like, look, this thing's going to happen. I know you think you're safe here, sneaking around the borders of the Fellery Forest, but I use his back, and he's not happy about this. And there are his forces here. So here's a fate point, everybody, because now it's a fight that you didn't ask for. Like, I'm not asking you to roll stealth or anything like that. I'm just saying this is happening now, and I'm bribing you to make it happen with a fate point. But because I have the aspect there in place, that happens. Now, I'm not, obviously, in D&D, you could say, like, oh, it turns out, well, I use his back, and you're here in the Fellery Forest, so things happen. But there's something really, it has more teeth to me when there's a mechanical thing that you can latch onto. Obviously, you can do anything you want when you're running a game, but it's cool. It's also cool for me to be able to say, like, or they're stealthing around, or they're scouting or something. And they could also invoke I use his back, be like, well, we're on high alert because we know I use his back. So we're all extremely aware, so when we're keeping watch, I'm going to invoke I use his back because I know, like, the players can interact with it directly there. And then, they can make new campaign aspects, or things can change. Let's say, I use isn't back anymore, and we deal with him. We can replace that with another aspect, a power vacuum or something. So, like, it can reflect, there are mechanical bits that reflect how the narrative changes in a way that you don't necessarily get in every game.
Yeah, I really like the way it works in Fate because it ties into that overall concept that everyone's bought into. Like, I struggle with GM intrusions in Numenera or Cypher system, because the GM intrusion is just sort of like, I want to do this. Let me give you some, XP as a payout for the fact that I'm going to do this to you. But Fate ties it into the larger architecture of your campaign or your character. And that's what I find makes it interesting, because you know when playing this game that you're buying into that. And the same thing happens in D&D. In D&D, you don't really necessarily, you don't have that same buy-in. So if someone just says, well, I'm going to have a patrol come by, it feels awkward. But it doesn't in Fate. And that's really quite impressive how they pull it off. It's simply done, but it works so effectively.
And the GM has a limited number of fate points per scene to make things like that happen. Not for compels necessarily, but anyway, this is a whole philosophical point. Now, where do the fate points come from?
Yeah.
But in D&D, I feel like I should be rolling on a table to figure it out. Like, does that thing happen? I'd like this thing to happen. I don't feel quite right if I just, like, make it happen all the time necessarily. Like, I want the players to see, like, it just happened. Like, we all can believe in the randomness of this world and everything. Whereas in Fate, I don't think I don't have to buy into the randomness. So I don't feel like I have to buy into that, because it's not random. I'm making choices, and we all know I am, because it's very meta. But, like, you see, I have these resources, these fate points I'm spending to make things happen sometimes. I had something else I thought about anyway.
Well, I can add that the one of the things that I think really helps is that in Fate, you have this sort of, like, higher concept of, I use his back, but you've also, in character creation or campaign creation, worked collaboratively to decide what the major organizations are. And so you might have, like, well, I use his Boneheart have come back, and they're all powerful and dead. Or any aspect, right? And so these things create kind of touch points, knowledge points that the characters have and the players have, so they expect things. If you do things like introduce that patrol, they might wonder, which Boneheart is that patrol associated with, right? Like, there might be these kind of interesting pieces that come in because the players know things, which is the opposite of a D&D campaign where you often are slowly doling out information and building, but it's all DM controlled versus player controlled, and that limits how much the players can interact with it and buy into it.
Yeah, and that reminds me too. It's like there's like Spout Lore in Dungeon World, or is it Barthforth Apocrypha in Apocalypse World, where you can add things on the fly to the setting. Like you're saying, like, I wonder what patrol they're from. Well, let's make a roll. And sometimes, you'll, I want to know more about that as part of a creative advantage or something like that, right? Because if I know about them, that's an advantage for me. It's an aspect. Everything can be an aspect. And sometimes, if the GM has an answer, the GM might tell you the answer. But lots of times in Fate, you make that roll and the GM says, okay, so who are they? Like, well, so where are they from? What's their deal? And the player says, oh, this. And go, oh, okay, well, that's the story there. So that's like on the fly adding things to the setting, right? It doesn't all have to happen at the beginning or a particular time. You can, there are many, many opportunities for that. In Atomic Robo, which is based on a comic book about action scientists going around doing weird action science things. In order to emulate that comic, there's a mechanic called brainstorming. And the way the game works is that the GM runs the game, like plans things out up to a certain point. And there's always a point in a game, in most games, where the players go like, well, what is going on? Like, what's the deal? Like, what do you think is going? And that's when we stop. Usually, it doesn't have to stop. It can be in the middle of another scene, but we have a brainstorm where the players figure out what's going on by making rolls. They like decide like, what evidence do we have about what this is? They bring up certain data points, and then someone comes up with a hypothesis about like what is happening, and then that is what's happening. If they're right about it, right? If they do the roll well enough, but that's what's happening. So they're telling the GM like, so here's what's happening in the setting right now. We've decided this is the deal, and the GM says okay, and then goes with that after that. So the players like players decide where things are going. In the middle of the adventure, the GM has seeded enough things so that like they're relatively sure where the players are probably going to take this, or they have a decent idea. But that's a chance for the players to just like not just decide on campaign stuff, but the adventure stuff, like what's happening right now. Where's this all going?
This reminds me of the comment we got from Lou Anders on Mastodon, where he says, "I love Fate. I usually describe it by saying that in D&D terms, Smog is an ancient red dragon, and Bilbo is at best a third-level rogue. It should be over quickly, but in Fate, Bilbo creates advantages by intriguing and provoking Smog, then creates the situational aspect, bare patch on left breast, then hands all these boosts over to Bard the Bowman, who creates the aspect, I have a black arrow, that we've literally never heard of before, and they stack them all to one-shot the dragon."
Yeah, that's exactly it. Also, a really great example is the fight against Thanos in Infinity War on Titan, when it's like Spider-Man says, I'm going to web that glove thing and pull it off his hand. And man says, I'm going to get up on him and tell him to sleep. I'm going to do this. Like, everyone's doing something separate to try to deal with Thanos. That's all of them making aspects and like trying to, get something to happen. Yeah. And then Star-Lord ruins it, obviously. But Star-Lord takes a compel from the GM. Yeah. Says like, you cannot possibly let it go like this. He killed Gamora is what he's telling. So I'm going to compel you to screw this all up. And Star-Lord says, fine, okay, I'll take the fake one. But yeah, there are so many examples. Again, like you could go on and on. Star Wars alone is full of examples of things that look like Fate. Yeah. Which is why I've used Fate to run Star Wars so much, because it just fits right together.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about the connections between the characters as opposed to the connections to the world. Fate really digs into this idea of not only are your aspects what you do and what you are good at, but how you are connected to each other and what that might mean for the story. Could you talk a little about that?
Sure. Well, like I said, during character creation, there are certain aspects that are part of your character, and there are aspects that are part of other things in the game, and temporary aspects that come up and go away and stuff. But if it's an aspect that's a part of your character, obviously it's a very permanent-ish part of the game. They can change over time. But during that session 0, which I think is like a good thing to do for every game, session 0, but in Fate, it's absolutely necessary because you have to sit down and come up with this stuff together. You can't make a character separate and then just show up for game day and, It just doesn't you wouldn't have things to write down. Like it wouldn't make sense. But it really depends on the particular Fate game that you're talking about. Like I said, in Spirit of the Century, the gimmick is, you appeared in each other's novels, so you decide how you guest starred, what happened in that, and then what was what aspect you have that reflects that interaction there. In other Fate games, it could be completely like more arbitrary, like you just give an aspect of the person on your left, and it might not, they might not have a whole lot to do with it. You decide like how you connect to them without them having a lot of say. It's more like paranoia, actually.
But I like in the core book, it talks about, a player that's saying, "Oh, I got into a bar fight," and then the other player goes, "Well, I helped you get out of that," right? Or and that kind of, and then that creates these kinds of nice connections, and then they can add on to that story however they see.
Yeah, it's also like Bonds and Powered by the Apocalypse, or like Dungeon World in particular. I always think of because I just played a ton of Dungeon World, but where that makes it very explicit, like for each character. But you probably, the thing about the aspects is you want something really double-edged. So you want something that can be like go for you and against you. You just want to be able to be compelled so you can get fate points out of it. So yeah, that's maybe tangential. I'm not sure why I went down that road, but
but so someone who helps you out of a bar fight could be sucker for someone in trouble. Right. And that kind of thing.
Or like, Osric always needs my help or something, that's a good aspect because it could be positive or negative. Like, I'm here to help you. You always need my help. I'm here, but this guy, I'm going to compel his aspect to make you come help him. Okay, fine. There's any number of ways that can be used, but Fate Core gives guidelines on how to do that in character creation. I'm looking at a stack of Fate books next to me, and there's just like so many ways that this happens. In fact, in Atomic Robo, there really aren't any of those kinds of connections, but everyone is an action scientist working for Tesladyne, so you have an implicit connection together to begin with. But yeah, just like as many versions of Fate as there are that many +2 ways of doing it. So it's
in most stories, conflict is the most interesting thing, and a lot of times in D&D, the conflict is only with the DM, that the story is telling, that who is telling the story. But with Fate, you can create that conflict amongst your party, and not only is it there to role play and to tell a story, but it can have mechanical weight. Right. That you can use, either compel or to spend that fate point to make that, to use that connection for your own benefit.
The compel is pardon me, my voice is changing. The compel is cannot be overemphasized about like how versatile also that is. Compels can come from the player or they can come from the GM. When it comes from the GM, you can spend a fate point to refuse it. Oftentimes it depends on what version you're playing here again, but to like say, like, I have the narrative clout to say, no, I'm not going to do that thing that you're suggesting I do. But the compel is a big deal for between players because it's all just about making the decision. Like, can you get this character to make a decision that is not in the best interest of another character?
Yeah.
And then, the mechanical bit, I'll say Fate is not great at PvP because it just comes down to who has more fate points, right? Because all the characters are pretty much equally powered. But being able to like create conflict in a party is often just about like who's going to make the choice to do what's ostensibly the wrong thing here.
And what I like about that is in D&D, it's almost like, if you want to play Han Solo and just run off from a scene, like you have screwed your party royally. Like the mechanics of all of it, it's almost like you can't do any conflict because any conflict is problematic. And you don't know where to take it. But with Fate, with these aspects, it creates a reason why you can disagree and feel you must do things. And the system is more flexible. You're not so worried about a TPK or anything like that. So you can handle it and it becomes part of the interesting story. And it allows the players to have those kinds of stories in a way that D&D, it's pretty hard to do that.
Yeah, for sure. And just the fact that there's no, I think this is part of it, but there's no separate combat system really in Fate. Like conflicts are conflicts, no matter what kind of conflict you're having. There's no like, there are the game terms of weapon and armor, but you can have weapon and armor for social conflicts too.
Right.
So like good reputation can be your armor in a social conflict.
Yeah.
There was your example about Han Solo taking off and coming back, and it reminds me of one of my favorite stunts from Spirit of the Century back in the day. It was called Master of Disguise, where you'd spend a fate point to drop out of the game. Your character would just like vanish. And then you, at a future scene, you'd come back as a nameless minion in the scene. You'd take your mask off and you're like, it's me, and you'd be back. And I love that so much. I made a whole character around that. My character was never actually in the scene. He was always disguised as someone else and always just showing up as a minion. But yeah, that would be very difficult to do in a lot of games, right? You would feel like I'm not playing if I'm not here right now. But like that can be your whole gimmick in a Fate game. And even just you can also be doing something related to what you can split the party and still have them be working it at the same thing, because you can be creating advantages over here making aspects that benefit the people over here, or vice versa. Even if you're not doing the same thing. There's also something in some editions of Fate called collateral consequences, where you kind of take in a conflict, you take what would be damage to you and you like shove it off onto the narrative instead. Like, I'm fine, but now that building's on fire. So now it's a problem to solve in the scene now. Or, I'm fine, but now Iu's forces are on the march for whatever, even if it's not related. It's just like another narrative thing has come down the pike that we got to deal with now. It's a little like clocks, and like Forge in the Dark or PBTA games where like, certain things happen, then a bad thing happens. You just make the bad thing happen by taking that collateral consequence. And that's another thing that can potentially affect the whole setting or campaign too.
So I know you've got to head off soon, but maybe before you head out, if you could tell us given that you love Fate so much and have so much experience, when you go and play a game like D&D, what do you pull from Fate into your D&D game? How do you approach that?
Well, I do use inspiration like fate points sometimes. First of all, I tell my players, you can only ever have one, but I will give you inspiration for any little cool thing you do, and then I want you to spend it right away so I can give it to you again. And you're going to feel like you're really getting away with something, but the upshot will be you're doing cool things all the time and getting rewarded for it. So isn't that what we want? But I will use inspiration sometimes to bribe someone, like a compel, like, hey, I'll give you inspiration if you go down there by yourself, or like I'll try to make their lives more complicated by offering them inspiration to do it. And like 9 times out of 10, it works. Another reason I need them to spend inspiration so I can give it to them again. So that's definitely a big thing. And also succeeding at a cost. I'm explicit about that, about how, you missed by 1, but you hit, or you did it anyway, but here, take some damage, or you drop this, or whatever happens. Like, don't let sometimes, missing by 1 is like a real bummer when you all, like you were saying before, you all feel like this thing should succeed or this should go well here. And then the dice say that it doesn't, and D&D doesn't really give you a recourse to like change what the dice said at all. So that succeeding at a cost is a big deal. It really goes a long way in D&D. Which I love, by the way. I don't want to give the impression that I don't love D&D. I really do.
Well, before we let you run, could you tell us where people can find you on the internet if they want to hear more about you and your exploits?
Oh, I don't have any exploits, but I'm on Twitter at Devlin1, DEVLIN1. I'd be on Mastodon, but I haven't really figured it out. I'm confused and scared. I'm 50 years old, and I don't know how to make Mastodon happen.
Well, I made it work, and I'm 50, so I'll send you a message later on how to do it.
You're my example as to how it works. So you give me hope to carry on.
It'll be weird for you because there's very low drama on there, so it's it's not a lot of aspects being compelled. It's strange.
Just aspects being created. So you can see I have I don't know. There's a lot of my work on Drive-Thru RPG. If you look up my name, a lot of Fate stuff on there, And on the DMs Guild too. I've written some Adventures League adventures and some other books and things I've collaborated on. I think that's it. I'd say Facebook, but I don't think anyone uses Facebook anymore for the things that I mean, I'm on it, but I'm not talking to people on it really. But if you're a friend of mine from Facebook, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. Obviously, we're friends, but I'm just not taking any new friends on Facebook right now. That's all. Yeah, I think that's it.
Awesome. Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And we will look forward to talking to you either online or in person in the near future.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Bye. All right. Well, there we had Mike Olson talking to us about the ins and outs of Fate. And we want to thank him for coming on the show to do that. If you would like to get a copy of Fate Core or any of the other flavors of Fate, you can do so directly at evilhat.com. You can also get it on drive-thru. So check it out. And thank you so much for listening, everyone out there. Thank you to our patrons who keep things going for us. And we would like to tell you a little bit more about some of our patrons, especially those patrons who are masters of the multiverse. You get a special shout out. Craig Bailey, Steve Bissonette, Evil John, Darren Chandler, Robin Dermy, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Shawn Hurst, Brian King, Travis Lee, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Eric Mengi, The Micro Ant, Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Krishna Simone Say It Again, Joe Tyler, Matias Valero at Twin Portals, James Walton, and Graham Ward. So thank you to our listeners. If you like the show, you can consider becoming a patron by going to patreon.com/masteringdnd. You could also give us a Apple Podcast review or a review via whatever program application you use to listen to the podcast. And you can subscribe to YouTube if you so choose. Hey, Teos, where can people find you?
Find me at alphastream.org. From there, you can reach my YouTube and other efforts. My latest blog is on one of the topics that we talked on the news show, the Creator Summit. And you can also find me on Mastodon as AlphaStream at dice.camp, sometimes on Twitter. And what about you, Shawn? Where do we hunt you down?
I'm still on Twitter at Shawn Merwin, but I'm also at Mastodon at Shawn Merwin at tabletop.social or social.tabletop. I always get those two confused. You could also find the show on Twitter at Mastering D&D and on Mastodon at Dice Camp. You can join our community via Patreon and leave comments on the Mastering Dungeons YouTube channel. So Teos, now that we've given all the news and we've faded ourselves out, what are we going to do now?
I'm going to invoke the aspect of basketball success.
I should have commented earlier on your Duke shirt. And good luck in the upcoming opening round versus Oral Roberts University. It's that dreaded 5 versus 12. So we're going to go root for the underdog.
We will pray for a victory.